We're good.
Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction. I will give you the caveat that I had so much cold brew on Monday. I actually then ramped it back because I do learn from my mistakes. I don't know if that's being in recovery or other things, but I do try to adapt. First of all, I just want to say I see people from Lancaster here. I actually just got to be in Lancaster in February to do this work at St. James and ended up with this just like deep love for Pennsylvania, which is really, really, really lovely and exciting. So I love that I'm able to continue to deepen this relationship with Stephenson School for Ministry, as well as some of the familiar faces that I see here this evening. I love a roadmap. I am an Enneagram 6, and I got to know where we're going. And so I wanted to start with just a little bit of a roadmap. I do want to tell you a little bit about me, which for some of you will be a repeat. And then I want to talk about the state of alcohol in our culture and world right now, before we then start to ask the question of why does that matter in the church? Which requires an exploration of dismantling some of the narratives that we might consciously or subconsciously hold around sobriety, so that we can then reframe how we think about it, knowing that all of that is actually going to be part of helping us grow in our hospitality, right? And then I want us to close the formal lecture out with really practical tips. I always get really frustrated when someone tells you all the problems and then says, like, have a great day. It's like, thanks a lot. That was super unhelpful. So want to talk about really practical ways for us to take the desire and passion that we have around growing in hospitality and really immediately put that into movement in our communities and in our spaces. Just to tell you a little bit about me, I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, if you can't hear that in the way that I sound when I talk. But one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about my story is that I actually was fundamentalist Baptist before I entered into the Episcopal faith. And I share that because I had very formative spiritual opinions about alcohol, and you can guess what they might have been. For a woman who was in like the buckle of the Bible Belt as a fundamentalist Baptist. And it wasn't until college that I transitioned over into being Episcopalian and entering into what was termed as a drinking church, right? A spiritual community where alcohol was present. And it was out of college and out of that tender discernment of just becoming Episcopalian that I also discerned becoming a priest in the Episcopal Church and feeling called to that. So I left undergrad and went directly to seminary here in Austin, Texas, actually. And I finished seminary and I was ordained a deacon at the age of 24 and a priest at the age of 25. So canonically the youngest a person could be to enter into ordained ministry in the Episcopal Church. And I worked in churches for about 7.5 years. And that was as a curate, as an associate rector, and then finally as a rector before I went down the path that led me to today. And it was in that last call, that rectorship, that years of discernment around my relationship with alcohol really came to their fruition. I had done a lot of breaks. I had tried to quit really privately many, many times. I had given alcohol up for Lent as a way to kind of try on sobriety to see if it was something that felt possible for me. But it was in that rectorship that I finally made the decision to quit drinking and decided that I was going to get sober, but that I was going to get sober quietly and privately, and that no one ever had to know about it. You might have noticed by the title of our lecture this evening that did not pan out for me. I like to joke that the fact that I'm like writing this book and doing this presentation is proof that God is not respecting my boundaries, because I was very clear with God that I would not be talking about it. But I had been invited to preach the clergy renewal of vows service for the Diocese of Oklahoma, which is where I was serving. And it was a big honor to be able to preach in front of all of the clergy in the state of Oklahoma. And between being invited to preach and getting into the pulpit, I received the news that multiple clergy that I knew and loved had been removed from ministry because of challenging relationships with substances. And I was a privately 4-month sober person who didn't want to talk about it, who was watching her friends suffer, who was tasked with the question of, what is God asking you to say to a room full of clergy? And I wrote 3 sermons. 2 of them were garbage, some of the worst sermons you'd ever heard in your life, because I was trying to not preach the thing that God had asked me to preach. And finally, I wrote the sermon, and for the first time in my life, I talked about my sobriety in a cathedral pulpit in front of the entire diocese. Not how I would have chosen that, but it was what I felt called to do. And after I had finished preaching that service, I went to a coffee shop and I put it on social media because I wanted to tell my truth on my own terms. It was my story and I wanted to share it out of my fullness. And I had to drive about an hour and a half to get home. And by the time I got home, my private messages on social media had exploded. My DMs were full of people who didn't know they knew anyone else was struggling with this. Clergy, people from churches I'd served, it was shocking to me how many people didn't know there was someone else that needed to change that part of their life. And it was in that sermon that a calling started, the calling that has become what I do today. And so I started to really discern what God was asking me to do with my ministry. And the way that that took form is that I left parish ministry to go work at a healthcare startup where I worked as a recovery coach and a writer and a speaker. I worked in group as well as one-on-one coaching settings, and then eventually left that company to start my own practice. So I now have my own work as a recovery coach, spiritual director, writer, and speaker. And I share all of that because I like to know who I'm talking to before I talk to them, but also because the work that I'm going to share tonight is coming out of a variety of different things in my life, right? This is coming out of my personal experience. This is also coming out of my work in the recovery field. It also comes out of my priesthood, my experiences in a variety of different congregations. I also worked directly under a clinician for many years. And so I got clinical background through working with her, some. It's also the work that I do with my clients, whether they're recovery coaching clients or spiritual directees. So I want to bring all of that in some way, shape, or form into the conversation tonight. I would be wild to not acknowledge that it's a difficult conversation. We're going to come in with a lot, probably. And so I want to encourage you to be gentle with yourself throughout this presentation. My requests of you are just that we stay open, that we tend to our hearts and our minds and our bodies and our souls when we're here today, and that we can have a spirit of wondering what God might be awakening in us, in our communities, and in the broader church. So I just ask for that openness in our conversation. And in order for us to really think about hospitality to people who don't drink or people who are sober, we have to start with just the reality of what's going on in our culture right now. I share this also because church and pastoral ministry necessarily speaks into the reality of our lives, right? The power and the beauty of the incarnation of Jesus Christ is that God chose to be with us in our lives. And so if we're going to bear the witness of Christ, we also then have to look into the reality of our lives around us. And what we know is that, first of all, we are in a pandemic reality. We're still in it, but we're also in a state of not knowing the extent of the toll it's going to take on us. We do know that drinking accelerated significantly, especially during quarantine. A really interesting statistic is that in 2020, among adults younger than 65 years of age, more people died from alcohol than COVID in the year 2020. There was a New York Times article talking about the real, true depth of how hard that was on us. More generally, if we were to look at the global toll that alcohol takes, about 3.3 million people die every year due to alcohol globally. And the total of deaths being around 3 million, that statistic goes all the way back to 2016. So every year, and it's been going up, right? It started at about 3 and we're at about 3.3 now, but at least 3 million people have been dying every year globally since 2016, which to me is a really staggering reality of the power and the intensity of the death that is around us. So before the pandemic, we actually had an epidemic, and it was alcohol. We were already in a state of crisis around this. And alcohol chemically affects us in mind, body, and soul. And so we're in a world that really needs healing around this present challenge. And there are a lot of reasons why I think sharing the statistics are important. And one of them is this. We have for a very long time tried to make the alcohol crisis a personal problem. For a very long time, we have said that is a personal problem, but 3.3 million people don't die because of a personal problem. 3.3 million people don't die because of a personal problem. And it's not only not personal, it's global, right? There is a global need in our culture for healing around this. And I believe, as a priest, that churches are called to be healing spaces in the world, and that we have the power and opportunity to have healing that includes healing around the crisis of alcohol. So, first of all, the role of the church is to acknowledge the crisis that we're in, because until we know, we don't know, right? There's a very long time, long before, there were years after 2016 that I didn't know any of this because it wasn't personally affecting me. So we learn, and then once we know, we grow in that knowledge. So even just acknowledging the reality of it, learning the reality of it is a step toward the addressing of this profound challenge. But if we wanted to look at why this might matter to the church, the most obvious thing that I think of is Jesus didn't destroy death because he was a fan of it, right? We just saw the death toll being in the millions, and death is inevitable, right? We are all mortal, but its inevitability doesn't mean that it grieves the heart of God any less. Also, categorically, when we look at statistics around the death toll of alcohol, it's actually termed as being a preventable death. That's the language we use about those millions of deaths. So they are preventable deaths. So yes, we have mortality, but millions of preventable deaths require the church's care and action. And I actually think it's Christ-like to look at these preventable deaths and to wish to destroy it. To wish to destroy and reduce deaths caused by alcohol in the spirit of knowing that and believing that Christ destroyed death. Also, if we want to move out of just thinking about death tolls, there is the call to the simple but profound act of hospitality that we find in our scriptures, the calling that we have to welcome the stranger with the same love that we would offer to a friend. This is huge, especially when we think about events, because we cannot possibly know what a stranger is facing, right? When a visitor comes into our community, we can't possibly know their relationship with alcohol. And yet we want to learn how to show up to them the way we would a friend, the way we would someone that we have cultivated a really long-standing relationship with. And that is this hospitality that the Bible really encourages us toward living into. And this hospitality and this compassion, especially for the Episcopal faith, of which I'm a priest, is not just important, but it's actually really core to what we believe. This idea of welcoming people is actually a pastoral imperative from our baptismal covenant. So the work of growing in our sober hospitality is one of the ways that we can hear the questions: will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor and yourself? And will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? This sober hospitality is how we can hear those questions and faithfully respond, I will, with God's help. Sober hospitality is part of seeking and serving Christ in all persons, loving our neighbors, striving for justice and peace, and respecting the dignity of every human being. This is also a really important and profound way that we show how much we care about people who are hurting. If we were to look at broad categorizations, society often blames people who struggle with substances. There's a lot of narrative around the idea that a person is asked for this or lived in a way that would beget this reality. But I have been in this field for coming up on 4 years now. So I've been coaching and working with people for almost 4 years. And the most common reason that a person ends up in front of me is that they are hurting. When I ask people, what led you today? Divorce, death of a child, death of a parent. I mean, think about the hardest things you could ever imagine a person facing. Those are the reasons that people end up struggling, right? They have had realities in their lives that had to be coped with, and they were doing the best they could with the tools they had at their disposal. And typically when they show up to recovery coaching, they're looking for new tools. So releasing those judgments and acknowledging that if the church wants to be a place to receive those who are hurting, sober hospitality is a pathway. Sober hospitality begins to show that we really do care about hurting people. And in order for us to expand that hospitality, to build on what I just mentioned, I want us to talk a little bit about dismantling our narratives. We have these dominant depictions of people who don't drink, these assumptions that are often made about people who don't drink that are conscious and unconscious. So this isn't a blame being given. We just have judgments. I still have judgments, right? Like I, laugh sometimes because if I meet someone who's like declines a drink, I'm like, oh, are you in recovery? And that's not true. There's lots of reasons people don't drink. So I'm also doing the work of changing the dominant narrative in my head. But these judgments can become barriers to hospitality. And also, they're often just not true. If you begin to actually get curious, you'll learn that there are a lot of different realities. Something that was really hard for me is that sobriety had always been depicted as like really negative, like sad and kind of pitiable, like, oh, that sounds awful, or this person must have a moral problem in their lives that made them end up in this state. This insinuation of failure, but also just this idea that it was super not fun. And I'm a really fun person. And so I was kind of like, I don't really know how I'm going to do this because I really like to be fun. But the reality in the work that I do is that the actual thing that I bear witness to in my life and in the lives of my clients and the people I work with is actually positive. Is that sobriety is a gift. It's a joy. If anything was a hindrance to my fun, it was alcohol, actually. It is freedom from alcohol that has allowed me to engage in the most fun of my life. Sobriety is the best thing that's ever happened to me, hands down. Hands down. And when we have these assumptions and we don't challenge that narrative, we can begin to look at something negative when it's really a profound positive. So even shifting our narrative to where when we find out someone is sober, we're like, wow, they must be really in their joy. That in and of itself is a different spirit that we have in our hearts when we welcome people. And I guarantee you people can tell. I guarantee you I can tell when someone's like, awesome. And when someone's like, oh, interesting. Uh-oh. Like it's a vibe, okay? Us intuitive people, we know, right? We know what's going on in that moment. So even cultivating a spirit of being happy for people when they don't drink, proud of people when they don't drink, or have chosen to not use other substances, that alone is a shift that is more hospitable than you might think. We also can have assumptions around if a person quit, they must have had these problems. They must have hit rock bottom. They must have, we can come up with scenarios in our heads like, oh, it must have gotten really bad. And that's why they had to quit drinking. And the reality is that for some people, there is no rock bottom. It is a decision that they don't want to drink anymore. For me, that was the thing. So I was like, I'm not happy in my body. I'm not happy in my heart. I want to be a joyful person. I am not going to drink anymore. So just opening ourselves up past those judgments, because how we receive people matters, and people can tell, and they feel loved and received inside of their joy when we can match that with a lack of judgment. And I want to offer that, but then I also want to think about how we're going to reframe this, right? Because we're losing our assumptions, but I, for one, speak as a sober person. I also speak as one part of this, right? So as I said before, I have my own assumptions. Like when I see someone turning down a drink, I'm like, are you also in recovery? And that's an assumption that I have to work on. And so I wanted to offer a list of a variety of different reasons why people might not be drinking. Because when I first made this list, it was helpful for me in opening up my own perspective. So here are a variety of reasons why a person may not drink. One, they might be sober. They also might just be trying to change their relationship with alcohol. They might be cutting back right now. They could be pregnant and not ready to talk about it. That extends to IVF. That extends to a lot of things surrounding fertility, right? Because alcohol and fertility are a whole conversation. They could be taking medicine that interacts really poorly with alcohol. That's very common with any mental health medicine. They typically all have warnings about those being contra to be used together. The person could be struggling with depression and not want to drink a depressant because how it will accelerate the depression they're already facing. They could be dealing with an illness in which pain is exacerbated through alcohol use, or they could have the knowledge that alcohol contributes to an illness that they already have. They could have trauma revolving around drinking, which has led them to not drink. They could also be trying to sleep better, since alcohol really affects our sleep negatively. They could be doing a break. Culturally, we've got things like Dry January and Sober October, which are these times when a lot of people just take a break and decide not to drink. They may not like the taste. I think it's important to mention that. Like sometimes people just don't like how alcohol tastes, and that's a reason to not drink. They might, and this is very common, they might have a family history around alcohol that means that they either don't drink or drink very rarely or are just very cautious. And that can also be connected to trauma, right? So if a person has been in an abusive household in which alcohol or other substances were a part of it, that can be a factor as well. They could be giving up alcohol for Lent or have other religious reasons why they're not drinking. I always want to give a little bit of a note that if you're doing interfaith work, there are plenty of Muslim people who don't drink at all. And there are customs in different religions and cultures where people don't drink. And so acknowledging that there are lots of different spiritual reasons why a person may not want to drink. And they could just not be drinking tonight, and it could be none of our business. Because there is a quote that I love from Annie Grace, who wrote This Naked Mind, which is an incredible book if you're looking for a book to read. And she says, alcohol is the only drug we have to justify not taking. Right? If I'm at a party and I'm like, yeah, no, I'm just not going to do cocaine tonight. For the most part at church, everyone's going to be like, that's fair. I think it's fair. But if I go to a church event and I'm like, oh no, I'm not going to have that. And people are like, you sure? I'm like, no, I'm sure. Right. So opening ourselves up to the fact that it can be as commonplace as saying at dinner, I'm going to have Diet Coke instead of water, or I'm going to have water instead of Diet Coke. It's just a choice. So the other thing about that list is I think if you were to take a second and look into your communities you're a part of, there is at least one ticker on there in your community, right? About how many people in your community do you think have a trauma history? About how many people in your community do you think, might be pregnant? About how many people in your community do you think take antidepressants? That's gonna be a lot of people, right? So this is a present reality, and it can become helpful to really see that and to be like, oh no, I know there are people in my congregation, in my school, wherever I am, that have these realities that might be choosing to not drink or drink differently because of them. So with this present reality, I want to offer some ways that we can start to be really tender to that reality. And one of them is to just start with a deep level of consciousness about the language we use when we talk about people who might be struggling. So not everyone considers themselves an alcoholic. That includes people who are sober or people who are in recovery. I personally don't use that language for myself. For a variety of reasons that we don't have enough time to get into, but I do self-identify as being sober and being in recovery. I think, when we labels can stigmatize and be unwelcoming, right? So my rule of thumb is to only use language for people that they use for themselves. So an example would be language like alcoholic, or the other term I hear a lot is addict. Someone calling someone else an addict. Now, examples of that I think are interesting. So I'm a massive John Mulaney fan. Like, I just adore John Mulaney. He was huge in my early recovery because he actually did bits about not drinking, because at the time he was sober from alcohol. If you know anything about John Mulaney, he's had a tumultuous past couple of years. And he actually has a new Netflix special that came out last night about him going to rehab, and he had an intervention. It's very raw. And it's not what you've seen from John Mulaney before, but in his special, he talks about himself and uses addict language to talk about his experience. And he has every right to do that. Nadia Bolz-Weber is another person I think of who's a Lutheran pastor who writes and refers to herself as an alcoholic and refers to herself as an addict. And for some people, that's very empowering and it's important to them and it's part of their identity. So I want to honor it when a person is being empowered by it, but not defaulting to language without talking to that person about their experience and how they're feeling. And so I offer that. And I want to also offer that we can remember that our general understanding about how we are in a relationship with addictive substances has really changed even in the clinical world. So when we think about how to be tender to this, I'm always really struck by this. So for a while, there were only two models of addiction, right? You can probably think of them. The moral failure model, which is the idea that, if you're struggling with substances, it was because of a moral failure, or the disease model. And the disease model is the idea that it's an illness, right? I have been afflicted with an illness related to why I struggle with addiction. What I love is that now we actually recognize other models of addiction. And one of the models that we recognize is sociocultural. This is the recognition that outside factors such as discrimination, lack of opportunity, poor quality of life, and other forms of marginalization affect how people drink because it affects how we cope. We also now acknowledge what's called the psychodynamic model, which is recognizing that mental health and trauma are major factors in our relationship with substances. So there are a wide range of reasons why a person might be struggling with substances. It could be genetics, it could be psychology, social realities, environmental factors, or combinations of multiple challenges heaped upon a finite person who is coping. And as the church, I believe in my bones that we want to care about the marginalized, that we want to offer compassion toward those who have that poor quality of life, that we want to offer healing to people who have struggled in their mental health and in their trauma. And one way for us to live into that hope is to offer even more hospitality toward those who, because of these realities, are now possibly struggling in their relationships with alcohol or simply choosing not to drink because of those realities. And the last reframe that I want to offer before we get into some practical opportunities is that we cannot assume that we know when a person is trying to quit or when they're thinking about quitting. We can't assume that we even know if they're in early sobriety. And I share this because there's a really common experience that I see in my coaching. And the experience is that one of my people shows up to our coaching call and says, I was doing so well. I was maintaining my sobriety, it had been like 2 weeks or a week. And I stayed sober up until I went over to my best friend's house. And in that moment, the best friend, they're just trying to be hospitable. They're just thinking, we always drink together. Like every Friday, we have a gin and tonic together because that's what we do together because this is how we've always been. The person shows up and it's so vulnerable. It's so difficult. The friend already has the drink poured practically and he puts it in their hand and they drink, right? Now, the friend in this situation is not a bad person, right? They are functioning in the way that their relationship has always been. But that friend could grow in their sober hospitality. Because the reality is that even your best friend that you drink with every Friday, that person might be trying to get sober right now. I have been that best friend. I had to decline most social engagements at the very beginning of my sobriety because everyone knew me as a drinker. And I knew I would walk in and that wine glass would be poured. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to say no to that, to be completely honest, because I didn't want to have to do all the talking about it. I wanted to just go in and have a nice night. So remembering that we really don't know who is trying to get sober and who is not. And I also want to offer to you the same scenario, but a little bit different. I want you to imagine that this person comes to me in a coaching call and says, I was doing really well. I was on 2 weeks or so, and I was fine and I was sober up until I went to church. People have set up coaching calls with me, one-on-one calls to strategize how they're going to go to church sober and stay sober through it. How they're going to go to fellowship events and not drink. How they're going to go to the church retreat. How they're going to go to the Episcopal conference. How they're going to go to, a vestry retreat, because those events feel so impossible. So imagine a person is sober up until the point they come to your church, and that's the place where they feel that pressure and that temptation. I know we don't want that, right? That's why I do this work. It's because I know that we don't desire that to be a reality, and yet it is. I have coached spouses who had not told their spouses that they were trying to get sober. So if spouses aren't telling spouses, it's likely that there are plenty of people in our churches that aren't telling us that they are looking into this part of their lives. So holding open that memory that we don't know is in and of itself a way that can shape our action toward hospitality. And as I said when I started, I don't want to just say a bunch of things and then say, here are all the problems, good luck. So a couple of thoughts on how we can actually shape practicing this in our communities. The first thing is kind of a joke about the Episcopal nomenclature regarding this. Begin to ask yourself as a community, is this non-alcoholic equally attractive? In the Episcopal Church, we joke that you have to have equally attractive non-alcoholic options, and I would like to give a response from the sober community, which is that we don't. They are not equally attractive. Like, I will see like 2 types of beer, and there's all this wine, and then there's like a seltzer and a Diet Coke. And I love seltzer and I love Diet Coke. I drink them all day. And in the evening, I want something fun. I want something different. Like, I am a fun person. We like to go out. So thinking about what would be a really nice option. What would be something that you, if you're a drinker, would want to drink if you weren't drinking that night? Like, put yourself in a situation where if there was no alcohol here and the only options were non-alcoholic, what would I enjoy drinking? And thinking about that as being a way to frame how you pick what you put out. I will also just say that like non-alcoholic options have come a really long way. I know capitalism is bad, but I'll take it on this one because it's this whole industry is really helpful for me. There are non-alcoholic spirits. You can get every single type of thing that you would have in liquor form in a non-alcoholic form. Athletic Brewery is a fully non-alcoholic brewery. And I actually have a friend who worked in the beer industry for many, many years at a really like award-winning microbrewery in Virginia. And they were telling me that in the beer world, Athletic is considered really good. Like, they were saying, no, like with beer people, we think it's really good. So that's how good it is. It's won awards up against alcoholic beer. So like, there are really good options for us to be having. So there's really no excuse for us to not have some really delicious options available that are actually equally attractive. Also, I'm going to be sending you after this event a PDF that's going to have 3 mocktail recipes that are recipes that I've pulled together. And they are specifically simple. The reason I made it specifically simple is because I got sober in rural Oklahoma. There was no Whole Foods down the road. So I wanted to have recipes that, like, no matter where you live, you can get these items, right? Also, a lot of these non-alcoholic places you can order it online if you really need to. But for me, accessibility, keeping things low to the ground, keeping things not super costly is also really important to me. So you'll receive mocktail recipes and some mantras and affirmations from my book as a gift after this session is closed. So wanted to give you something that you could immediately begin serving in your communities if you so decide. Additionally, when you think about non-alcoholic options, one thing that is kind of fun is to think about not just non-alcoholic options, but comparable non-alcoholic options. And what I mean by that is if you're doing a themed event and your alcoholic beverages are themed, maybe offering non-alcoholic versions of something that is on theme, because sometimes sober people like themes. I like to dress up and go be a part of a theme. And so I know in the Episcopal Church, we don't have like liquor at things, so this is a little bit less of a thing, but I've also been to church parties at parishioners' homes where liquor could be present and they've got like margaritas. Well, having virgin margaritas accessible is a really nice way to say, we want you to have the fullness of this experience. And again, not feel like everyone else is drinking margaritas and you have tap water, which is a very real possibility. So making sure we have really delicious things for people is really fun. Something that's more of a way that we host that's actually really important is I encourage you in a communal setting to not actually offer people alcohol. Let people ask for it if they want it. When a person walks in, you can certainly say, food's over here, drinks over here, etc. But I've been to church events where the first thing someone asked me was red or white. Like, I had barely made it in the room before someone was like, Chardonnay or Cab? And so we like to be like, do you want this alcohol? And we're adults, right? We're all supposed to be adults going into this event. So let the person have agency to pick what they want to pick, to grab what they want to grab. And here's why. People are often very private, in a very interior way, quitting drinking. It is very helpful and hospitable for us to put them in less situations where they have to actively decline alcohol. It's actually very difficult to decline drinks when you're trying to quit. Another thing that has been super fun for me in recovery is digging into neuroscience. I didn't realize I would become a brain nerd when I quit drinking, but recovery is actually an act of neuroplasticity. It is an act of literally changing the human brain. It is an act of changing neural pathways and habit change additionally. So what that means is that it's exhausting. Like when you're getting sober, your brain is fried. Like it's just fried. I don't know what else to say about it. So when I work with people, I really encourage them to cut down on stress generally, but also I encourage them to cut down on cognitive exertion. So something as simple as like HelloFresh or ordering takeout, things that you're not having to make decisions because you will already have cognitive fatigue. So when you're hosting and you reduce the amount of situations in which a person has to actively decline alcohol, you're actually helping support them through that cognitive process. So sounds small, incredible, like huge way to help. Also akin to that is the idea of creating a self-serve table for non-alcoholic options. What that allows people to do is just kind of go in and get their beverage and have a lovely night and not have to have a conversation about it. I coach people through strategies on how to move through an event that has alcohol because it's really vulnerable, right? And so when a person just gets to go in, fix their drink and move on, that feels good for them, right? That is a reduction in that cognitive work. So again, possibilities of having a self-serve table for non-alcoholic options can be helpful. Again, sounds simple, can actually be really helpful. Offer the same glassware for non-alcoholic options that you have for your alcoholic beverages, because if a person's feeling vulnerable, it feels much nicer to just walk in, get whatever you get. Nobody has to know what you're drinking, right? In the bar setting, when I work with people and they're trying to figure out how to not drink, I often just tell them go early, get a tonic and lime. No one's going to know what you're drinking and nobody needs to know what you're drinking. This is none of their business, right? If a person wants to talk about their sobriety, they can, but giving people the opportunity to just blend in and for it to not be a big deal can be really supportive of people. And again, work on some of that cognitive and emotional weight that we may not realize, right? It may not seem like it's that big of a deal, but as someone who had to do so many firsts, I mean, I remember my first plane trip, I remember my first Episcopal conference, my first, all of the things that I had to do as my firsts, they seem really hard. And so these small things help people feel a little bit less like there are barriers to them being able to just be fully received in your community. Also, in your communications, share that you're going to have non-alcoholic options. Like, be proud of it. Put in there, you know, we're going to have this and we're going to have this and we're going to have, maybe we're going to have red wine and we're going to have athletic brewery, because people get excited about that. Also, if I'm sober and I'm trying to figure out if I'm going to go to your event, I'm going to default to assuming you don't care about me because the norm is that people don't have non-alcoholic options. So I might, like I said, I distance myself from a lot of people in early sobriety. And I think if I'd known that there would be non-alcoholic options present, I might have gone to a lot more events. So there will be people who see that and then say, okay, now I know I can go, when I otherwise would have maybe just assumed that it wouldn't have been a good idea for me. People constantly, this is so fun. People constantly send me pictures of like menus that have mocktails. Because they're just so excited that it exists. And I mean, my friends who drink are like, isn't this cool? And I'm like, it is cool. I think there is something to be said for the feeling that I would have in early sobriety, where I would just go in and I would just get my mocktail and I would have a great time, and I would be my extroverted time, and I would go home and I would be like, it was a non-issue and I had a blast, right? And I think what we want in our religious and spiritual spaces is for people to, first of all, come to the event. Please, like, come be with us in the church and be able to go home and say it was a non-issue and I had a blast, right? That's how visitors become members, is because they're able to come and meet other people and go to these fellowship events too. They're able to go and be at these specific things that we've created to build that more intimate community. The last thing I want to mention before I do a little closing is to try to be really conscious about how alcohol might be showing up as a bid for connection. And I have a story around this. And the story is that I was in early sobriety and I was invited to an ordination, which is great, right? I'm a priest. Of course, I want to go to local ordinations in my area. And it was at like noon. And so I was like, oh, this will be fine. Like, it's in the middle of the day. And I go to this ordination and everything's fine. And then it's time for the reception and I want to go see the ordinand, and I'm hanging out. Very early, very privately sober at this point. And the people keep walking up to me and they're like, do you want some champagne? And I'm like, oh no, I'm fine, thanks. And another person is like, do you need some champagne? Like, holding out glasses of champagne at me. And I'm like, it is 1:30 p.m. Like, I am feeling like I'm being accosted by champagne. And literally like 4 people like came up to me and were like, do you need some champagne? And I started to get really frustrated, and it was just like really upsetting. And I finally was thirsty and I went and I got a water, and they stopped bothering me. And I realized, oh, they were just trying to put a drink in my hand. I didn't have a drink in my hand. And they were trying to be hospitable. And there was going to be a toast, and they wanted to make sure everyone had their drinks for the toast. And, I can look at that and I can say, like, I know their heart. Their heart was to be hospitable. And so I want to honor that. I can also tell you in honor that it was not hospitable to me. I was pretty upset. There was a part of me that never wanted to darken the door of that church ever again. And I was able, of course, to parse that and to do the work and to be like, this is just hospitality, et cetera, et cetera. But these attempts at hospitality that we offer out of deep love and deep desire to build our church, they may not reach that desired end of loving and welcoming new people if alcohol is the bid for connection that we're using. Because again, we don't know anyone's relationship with alcohol aside from our own. And even that might be something that we're figuring out. And I say that as someone who spent years figuring out her relationship with alcohol to then decide to no longer have one. And before we open it up, which I want to do in just a minute, I want us to have a nice, robust way to have a conversation. I do want to offer and encourage you deeply to be really gentle with yourself as you set out to maybe think about how your communities could become more hospitable. This is a lot. I just shared an hour's worth of things that I've been working on for 4 years. Actually, in sobriety, I'm coming up on like 5 years, so much longer than that. But still, point being, takes time. Again, like I said before, I still make assumptions. I'm working on my own assumptions as a person in recovery. So I don't say this to say, oh, you need to do this. I say this to say, first of all, I was a person who would not have been safe to be around if you were sober, right? So I've learned through my own experience of becoming sober how to be hospitable to this. And also, the fact that you're here is a big deal. Give yourself credit for caring, because to be completely honest, a lot of people don't. So by virtue of being here, that's a step forward. The lowest hanging fruit, I think, is just to like have a couple of non-alcoholic options that are just a part of your standard rotation in your communities, just so that you always have that there. If you have some non-alcoholic options, if you start putting that into your event promotion and continue to be the hospitable way that you are, that alone is amazing work. And people see it, okay? Like when I walk into a church, I'm not expecting them to, move heaven and earth. I'm expecting them to be loving and to be kind and to be trying. And I think that's what most people want. And so trying is a spiritual act toward this hospitality in and of itself. You can't control other people. You can't shield people who don't drink from ever navigating a tricky situation around alcohol in their whole life, right? And no one's expecting you to. You're here, you're doing the work. You can talk with your small groups or communities. You can remember that, when we know better, we do better. And now we know better. I didn't know any of this until I knew it either. That's the good news, right? And again, by virtue of you being here, you're already doing your best to bring on in a new heart of hospitality to care for people who are sober or people who don't drink. And I profoundly thank you for that, because your presence here is not lost on me. There's a lot of things we can do on Wednesday evenings. And I appreciate that you thought that this was important enough to spend your time here. And I do want to, Sarah, let us just chat now, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. If you want to, you can use your digital hand to sort of indicate that you're next in line. Or you can start in the chat if you want just a reminder about how we are working. That was obviously my spouse that just popped in. He just came back from a meeting at church, so he's completely oblivious sometimes, but that's okay. Sometimes he thinks that I'm just listening to podcasts. That's what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. So that way our conversation is not on the record. It is just kept between us. And so I would say, and Erin Jean can probably do this more eloquently than we are, that we respect each other and each other's privacies. So that's, again, I'm sure Erin Jean has a better phrase for it. So I'm going to stop the recording so we can go ahead.